Across the ancient Near East, stone was never merely stone. It endured where flesh failed, remembered where memory faded, and bore witness long after kingdoms collapsed into dust. When ancient peoples carved words into stone, they did so with the conviction that the message was not only for the present, but for eternity. This belief shaped law codes, treaties, funerary inscriptions, and most significantly, encounters with the divine. In the Hebrew scriptures, stone appears repeatedly at moments where heaven and earth are said to touch. Altars were built of uncut stone. Covenants were marked with pillars. Sacred boundaries were inscribed rather than spoken. Yet no object embodies this convergence more powerfully than the stone tablets associated with Sinai. Objects described not merely as written upon, but as authored beyond human agency. The text insists that the writing itself was not Moses' work, nor a priestly invention, but something altogether other. The tablets are described as bearing writing that came directly from the divine hand. Ancient Hebrew uses language that is deliberate and unusual, emphasizing not only the origin of the tablets, but the nature of the inscription itself. The writing is presented as complete, authoritative, and final. It is not dictated. It is not transcribed. It is engraved. In the ancient imagination, engraving implied permanence and perfection, qualities attributed not to human scribes, but to divine craftsmanship. Early Jewish interpreters lingered on this detail. The tablets were not described as written in ink or pigment, but as carved through the stone. Rabbinic traditions preserved in Midrash describe the letters as passing entirely through the tablets, readable from either side, suspended within the stone itself. This was no ordinary script. It behaved in ways no known writing system could. The letters were said to defy gravity, symmetry, and material constraint. Such descriptions are not decorative embellishments. They reflect a long-standing belief that the language of heaven differs fundamentally from human speech. Angels, in Jewish and early Christian literature, are consistently portrayed as communicators of divine will, yet their mode of speech is rarely equated with everyday human language. When angels speak to humans, their words are often described as adapted, lowered, or translated into forms mortals can endure. This concept appears explicitly in apocryphal literature. In texts such as 1st Enoch and Jubilees, heavenly beings possess knowledge inaccessible to humanity, including languages tied to creation itself. Enoch is said to learn writings not taught by humans, and to record heavenly knowledge using forms that predate earthly alphabets. The implication is subtle but profound. Human language is not original. It is derivative. Ancient Near Eastern cultures shared similar intuitions. Mesopotamian myths describe the gods establishing order through spoken decrees that shape reality. Egyptian theology regarded divine speech as performative, capable of bringing existence into being. In these traditions, language is not merely descriptive, it is generative. Words spoken by divine beings do not explain reality, they create it. Against this backdrop, the Sinai tablets emerge as something more than legal documents. They represent an interface. The laws themselves are intelligible, but the manner of their inscription points to an origin beyond human linguistic systems. The tablets are a material artifact carrying traces of a mode of communication not native to humanity. Archaeology reinforces the strangeness of this claim. Known writing systems of the late Bronze Age, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, proto-alphabetic scripts, all developed gradually, showing clear lines of evolution. None appears suddenly complete, perfectly ordered, and universally authoritative. Yet the biblical tradition presents the tablets as fully formed, requiring no development, revision, or interpretation at the moment of their creation. This tension did not go unnoticed by ancient commentators. Some suggested that the language of the tablets was not Hebrew as humans know it, but a primordial form, a sacred tongue spoken before the division of nations. Later, Jewish mysticism would call this the language of creation, the speech by which the world itself was spoken into existence. Angels, according to these traditions, preserved this language, while humanity received only fragments. The Dead Sea Scrolls reflect similar ideas. Certain sectarian writings treat language as hierarchically structured, with heavenly speech occupying a higher, purer register. Liturgical texts describe angelic worship conducted in precise, powerful formulations, distinct from human prayer. These formulations were believed to align the speaker with celestial order, not by emotion, but by exactness. Importantly, none of these traditions claim that humans could freely use angelic language. On the contrary, access was dangerous. Improper speech could disrupt cosmic balance. Words spoken incorrectly might invite judgment rather than revelation. This fear of misuse appears repeatedly in ancient texts, suggesting that language itself was viewed as a form of power requiring restraint. When later writers reflected on the destruction of the first tablets, shattered at the foot of Sinai, they interpreted the act not only as punishment for idolatry, but as the loss of something irretrievable. According to some rabbinic interpretations, what was broken was not only stone, but access. The second tablets, though equally sacred, were carved by human hands. The difference mattered. From this perspective, the stone tablets stand at a crossroads of theology, linguistics, and mythic memory. They are remembered not just for what they said, but for how they were said, through a medium and a language that ancient communities believed did not belong fully to this world. What remains is not a preserved alphabet, nor a surviving inscription, but a persistent question echoed across centuries of scholarship and faith. If angels spoke a language different from humanity's, and if traces of that language once existed in stone, then the tablets were never meant to be read as ordinary text. They were meant to remind humanity that divine communication, at its origin, was something altogether other. In ancient thought, language was never neutral. Words carried weight, intention, and consequence. To speak was to act, and to write was to bind that action into permanence. This belief shaped how ancient cultures understood divine communication, especially when that communication was believed to originate beyond the human realm. The idea that angels possessed a distinct mode of speech was not metaphorical. It was structural, embedded in how ancient peoples understood reality itself. Hebrew tradition preserves a layered view of language. At the surface is everyday speech, flexible and contextual. Beneath it lies a more formal register used in ritual, law, and covenant. Beyond that, texts allude to a primordial mode of speech, older than nations, older than division, older even than writing, as humans know it. This deeper language was believed to operate not through description, but through alignment with divine order. The Hebrew word, often translated as word, carries meanings that extend far beyond vocabulary. It can signify command, decree, or event. In creation narratives, divine speech does not report reality, it brings reality into being. Light exists because it is spoken. Order emerges because it is named. This is not poetic flourish. It reflects a worldview in which speech is causative, not symbolic. Angels within this framework are not merely messengers delivering verbal information. They are extensions of divine will, executing commands that are themselves linguistic in nature. When angels appear in Scripture, their speech is often brief, precise, and final. They do not debate. They do not explain unless required. Their words function like seals, closing possibilities rather than opening discussion. Early Jewish texts make this distinction explicit. In apocalyptic literature, angels are depicted as guardians of knowledge inaccessible to humanity. They interpret visions, measure cosmic boundaries, and record deeds using systems humans cannot replicate. Enoch's transformation into a scribe of heaven is described not as learning new facts, but as being granted access to a different mode of comprehension entirely. This distinction is reinforced by how heavenly writing is described. In several traditions, divine texts are not written sequentially. They exist as complete entities, eternal and unchanging. Human writing unfolds in time. Heavenly writing exists outside it. The stone tablets, described as fully inscribed at the moment of their revelation, align with this concept. They do not evolve. They arrive. The material choice of stone is significant. In the ancient Near East, stone inscriptions were reserved for laws, treaties, and declarations meant to transcend generations. Unlike clay tablets, which could be erased or reused, stone declared finality. When divine law appears on stone, it signals not only authority, but permanence. Yet, the biblical account goes further, emphasizing that the inscription was not merely placed on stone, but integrated into it. Later, interpreters seized on the description that the writing passed through the tablets. This detail appears repeatedly in rabbinic literature, not as legend, but as theological assertion. A script that pierces stone suggests a language unconstrained by physical limitations. Letters that do not collapse when detached from material support challenge ordinary assumptions about writing altogether. This concept finds parallels beyond Israel. In Mesopotamian belief, the gods possessed tablets of destiny, objects that recorded the fixed order of the cosmos. Whoever held these tablets held authority over reality itself. Though culturally distinct, the shared idea is striking. Divine order is encoded, written, and guarded. Writing is power. The difference lies in accessibility. In Mesopotamian myth, divine writing remains firmly in divine hands. In the biblical narrative, a fragment of that authority is temporarily entrusted to humanity. The tablets are given, not seized. They are revealed, not discovered. Yet, the narrative is clear that this access is conditional, fragile, and easily lost. When the tablets are destroyed, the event is described with unusual gravity. The breaking is not only physical. Ancient commentators interpreted it as a rupture in communication. Something unique was lost, something that could not simply be recreated. The second set of tablets, though sacred, required human participation in their creation. This distinction mattered deeply to later thinkers. Some traditions suggest that the first tablets contained more than law. They held clarity, unity, and unmediated understanding. Humanity, according to these interpretations, was briefly elevated to a state where divine will was not debated or misunderstood. The loss of the tablets marked a return to ambiguity, interpretation, and struggle. This idea resonates with broader ancient beliefs about the fall of humanity. Knowledge once held was fragmented. Language once unified became divided. Communication once direct became mediated through symbols, rituals, and institutions. Angels, however, remained untouched by this fragmentation. Their language, according to tradition, retained its original coherence. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide further insight. Several texts distinguish between earthly speech and the language of the heavenly host. Community members sought alignment with angelic worship through precise liturgical formulations, believing that correct language could synchronize human prayer with celestial order. This was not mysticism for its own sake. It was discipline. Precision mattered because language was believed to shape reality. A misplaced word could distort meaning. An incorrect formulation could disrupt harmony. This belief explains the intense care with which sacred texts were copied, preserved, and pronounced. Language was not flexible clay. It was sacred architecture. Within this worldview, the idea of an angelic language inscribed on stone tablets becomes coherent rather than fantastical. It represents a moment when divine communication bypassed human limitation. The tablets did not merely convey commandments. They embodied a form of speech closer to the source of existence itself. What remains today is not the language itself, but the imprint it left on tradition. Ancient communities remembered that there was once a form of communication purer, stronger, and more dangerous than ordinary speech. They remembered that it was briefly entrusted to humanity, and that humanity proved unable to bear it. The stone tablets thus stand as silent witnesses to a lost mode of speech, not lost in the sense of misplacement, but withdrawn, preserved only in memory, commentary, and reverent restraint. The question that haunted ancient interpreters was not whether such a language existed, but why it was no longer spoken. Ancient traditions did not imagine angelic language as poetic metaphor. It was treated as technical, exact, and governed by rules as strict as those of ritual purity or sacred space. To speak in the language of heaven was not to express emotion or belief, but to participate in a structure believed to underlie reality itself. This is why access to such language was restricted, mediated, and surrounded by warnings. Within Jewish tradition, the idea of a primordial tongue appears repeatedly. Before nations were divided, before borders and cultures fractured human speech, there existed a unified mode of communication. This language was not merely common, it was coherent with creation. Later interpreters identified this with the speech used by God in creation and preserved among the angels who did not fall into human limitation. The story of linguistic division at Babel reflects this worldview. The confusion of tongues is not presented as inconvenience, but as rupture. Humanity loses shared access to a deeper order of meaning. Speech becomes fragmented, localized, and contextual. Angels, however, remain outside this fragmentation. Their language is not confused because their role is not social communication, but execution of divine will. Apocryphal literature expands this idea. In 1 Enoch, angels are repeatedly associated with secret knowledge conveyed through precise formulations. When fallen angels teach humanity forbidden arts, the danger lies not only in what is taught, but in how it is transmitted. Knowledge conveyed through improper channels disrupts cosmic order. Language, in this sense, is a conduit that can carry corruption as easily as truth. The Testament of Solomon, a later text reflecting earlier traditions, presents a striking example. Demonic beings are compelled to reveal their names, functions, and limitations. Naming here is not identification, it is control. To know the true name of a being is to possess authority over it. This belief presupposes a language in which names are not labels, but expressions of essence. Angels, by contrast, are rarely named fully in Scripture. When names appear, they are descriptive rather than comprehensive. They reflect function rather than essence. This restraint suggests an awareness that full access to angelic language would grant power beyond human capacity to wield responsibly. Silence, therefore, becomes a form of protection. The stone tablets fit precisely into this pattern. They present divine instruction without exposing the mechanics of divine speech. The laws are intelligible, but the method of inscription hints at something withheld. The letters are visible, but their origin is emphasized as non-human. The tablets reveal content while concealing process. Early rabbinic thought returned again and again to this paradox. Why were the letters carved through stone? Why did the tablets not require human inscription? Why were they broken so soon after being given? These questions were not academic curiosities. They reflected a deeper concern about boundaries between heaven and earth. Some interpretations suggest that the first tablets contained layers of meaning inaccessible after their destruction. The second tablets preserved the law, but lost the immediacy of divine clarity. Human interpretation replaced direct apprehension. Study replaced encounter. This shift defined the religious experience that followed. Language plays a central role in this transition. Once divine speech is no longer directly accessible, humanity must rely on commentary, debate, and tradition. Words become objects of analysis rather than vehicles of power. The sacred text remains authoritative, but its language must be unpacked, contextualized, and defended. This dynamic is evident in the development of scribal culture. Scribes treated language with extreme care, counting letters, preserving forms, and guarding against alteration. This meticulous attention reflects an underlying belief that language, especially sacred language, retains a residue of its original power. Even when the angelic tongue is no longer spoken, its shadow persists. The Dead Sea Scrolls illuminate this tension vividly. Some communities believed they could partially restore alignment with heavenly order through disciplined language use. Their hymns describe participation in angelic worship, not symbolically, but structurally. Correct phrasing, rhythm, and sequence were believed to matter. Yet, even these communities acknowledged limits. They did not claim to speak as angels speak. They sought harmony, not equivalence. The boundary remained intact. Angelic language was not democratized. It was approached with caution. This caution is echoed in early Christian literature. The apostolic writings emphasize that heavenly realities are mediated through Christ rather than accessed directly. Revelation comes through incarnation, not linguistic assent. This shift does not deny the existence of angelic language. It reframes access to the divine as relational rather than technical. Nevertheless, traces of the older worldview persist. References to heavenly books, sealed scrolls, and words known only in heaven appear throughout early Christian texts. The idea that divine communication operates on a level beyond human language remains intact. Archaeology offers indirect confirmation of this mindset. Sacred inscriptions across the ancient world often employ archaic forms, intentionally preserved long after spoken language evolved. This suggests a belief that older forms carried greater authority. Age conferred sanctity. Distance from everyday speech signaled closeness to the divine. The stone tablets represent the extreme expression of this belief. They are not archaic human language, but divine inscription made visible. Their authority derives not from antiquity alone, but from origin. They stand at the threshold between what can be spoken and what must remain unspoken. By the time later generations reflected on these traditions, the angelic language had become an absence rather than a presence. It was remembered not through preservation, but through loss. The very fact that it could no longer be spoken became part of its meaning. The enduring power of the stone tablets lies precisely here. They testify to a moment when divine communication crossed into human history without fully surrendering its otherness. They remind humanity that language itself has limits, and that beyond those limits lies a mode of meaning no longer accessible, but never forgotten. As traditions matured, scholars began asking not only what the tablets contained, but what kind of language could exist beyond ordinary speech. This inquiry did not belong solely to theology. It intersected with early linguistics, philosophy, and ritual practice. Language was increasingly understood not merely as sound or symbol, but as structure, a system capable of ordering thought, behavior, and even reality. Ancient Hebrew itself preserves traces of this awareness. Certain words resist precise translation, carrying ranges of meaning that shift depending on context. This ambiguity was not seen as weakness, but as depth. Words were believed to carry layers, some accessible through study, others through obedience, and some through divine revelation alone. The possibility that an angelic language existed suggested that human language was an adaptation, not a source. In this framework, angels do not communicate to exchange information. They communicate to enact purpose. Their speech is closer to command than conversation. This distinction explains why angelic appearances in Scripture are often accompanied by fear. The encounter is not frightening because of appearance alone, but because of proximity to unmediated authority. To hear such speech is to stand before something irreversible. Ancient commentators notice that when angels speak, they do not persuade, they declare. Even when questions are asked, the responses are limited. This restraint reflects a belief that angelic language does not tolerate ambiguity. Human speech negotiates meaning. Angelic speech delivers it. The difference is qualitative, not stylistic. The stone tablets align with this pattern. The laws are presented without justification or argument. There is no explanatory preface, no philosophical reasoning. The commandments are given as facts of reality, not proposals. This mode of communication mirrors angelic speech as understood in ancient thought. Some scholars have suggested that the tablets represent a convergence of language and law. Law, in ancient societies, was not merely regulatory, it was cosmological. To violate law was to disrupt order. When law is presented in a language linked to divine speech, obedience becomes alignment with creation itself. This idea finds support in comparative studies. In Mesopotamia, royal laws were often framed as reflections of divine justice. The king ruled by enforcing cosmic order. However, those laws were mediated through human authority. The Sinai tablets differ sharply. No king authors them. No council debates them. Their authority bypasses political structures entirely. This bypass created tension. Human communities require interpretation. Law must be applied to new situations. Yet the tablets resist modification. Their origin places them beyond revision. This tension gave rise to extensive interpretive traditions, not to change the law, but to reconcile immutable words with changing realities. Language again becomes central. Interpretation is possible only because the tablets are rendered in human-readable form. The angelic origin does not eliminate human language. It anchors it. The commandments can be spoken, taught, debated. Yet their authority remains tied to a moment when language exceeded humanity. Later, mystical traditions pushed this insight further. They proposed that the letters themselves carried power independent of meaning. Each letter was believed to reflect a force or principle embedded in creation. Combined correctly, letters could mirror divine action. Combined incorrectly, they could cause harm. This belief did not emerge in isolation. It reflects a broader ancient conviction that symbols participate in what they signify. Writing is not representation, it is participation. In such a worldview, an angelic language would not describe heaven. It would operate as heaven does. This explains the caution surrounding sacred names. Certain names were spoken only in ritual context, others not at all. The concern was not superstition, it was containment. Names spoken improperly could activate realities beyond human control. Silence was safety. The destruction of the first tablets, therefore, takes on added meaning. It represents the withdrawal of a form of language too potent for a fractured community. Humanity receives law, but not the full force of divine speech. Mediation replaces immediacy. Archaeological evidence offers subtle support for this shift. Early inscriptions often emphasize divine authorship. Later texts increasingly emphasize human scribes. The transition reflects a growing awareness of distance between heaven and earth. Language becomes more explanatory, less declarative. Yet memory preserves what practice no longer allows. Texts continue to allude to heavenly speech, sealed books, and words known only above. These references function as boundaries, reminding communities that not all knowledge is meant to be accessed directly. The stone tablets occupy this boundary space. They are tangible, yet untouchable in origin. They speak, yet conceal. Their language is readable, yet unreachable in essence. They communicate law while gesturing toward a mode of speech that exceeds law entirely. In this sense, the tablets are not merely historical artifacts. They are symbols of restraint. They mark the point where divine communication intersects human limitation and then withdraws. What remains is enough to live by, but not enough to master. This restraint shaped religious consciousness for centuries. It fostered humility before text, reverence for language, and caution toward claims of unmediated revelation. To claim access to angelic speech was to invite suspicion, if not condemnation. Thus, the angelic language spoken through stone was never meant to be recovered as a tool. It was meant to be remembered as a warning. Language can shape worlds, but only within bounds humanity can bear. Beyond those bounds, silence becomes not absence, but mercy. The belief that language could shape reality led ancient thinkers to treat writing itself as a sacred act. This was especially true when writing was associated with divine origin. Letters were not arbitrary signs. They were vessels of meaning, order, and authority. To inscribe words was to stabilize them, to fix intention into matter. When those words were believed to originate beyond humanity, their inscription carried immense theological weight. In this context, the stone tablets represent an anomaly. Most ancient sacred texts emerge through a process: oral transmission, memorization, gradual inscription, and eventual canonization. The tablets, by contrast, appear suddenly, complete, and unmediated. They do not pass through generations of transmission. They arrive fully formed, bypassing the usual human filters that shape language over time. This suddenness troubled later interpreters. Human language evolves, meanings shift, pronunciation changes, writing systems adapt. A language that arrives fully formed suggests an origin outside history. Angels, as beings understood to exist beyond time-bound processes, provided a conceptual framework for such an origin. Their language, like their existence, was imagined as stable, exact, and immune to decay. Ancient Jewish traditions increasingly associated angels with guardianship over cosmic structures. They were believed to oversee elements, seasons, nations, and even linguistic order. Some texts suggest that angels preside over languages themselves, maintaining coherence within the diversity of human speech. This idea implies that language is not merely social convention, but part of cosmic governance. Within this framework, the tablets can be seen as a convergence point where cosmic language intersects human history. The commandments are delivered in words humans can understand, yet their structure, origin, and authority reflect something more than human authorship. The laws are not argued into existence. They are declared as facts. This declaration mirrors how divine speech is portrayed in creation narratives. There is no negotiation, no deliberation. Speech itself accomplishes purpose. Angels, as executors of divine will, are portrayed as operating within this same linguistic economy. They do not interpret commands, they enact them. The difference between angelic and human language becomes especially clear in moments of miscommunication. Humans misunderstand, reinterpret, and dispute. Angels do not. When an angel delivers a message, it is precise and limited. The message ends when its purpose is fulfilled. There is no surplus. This economy of speech suggests that angelic language is optimized for function rather than expression. It does not exist to convey personal perspective. It exists to implement order. Such a language would be dangerous in human hands, not because of malice, but because of misalignment. Human intention is divided. Angelic intention is unified. The fear of misalignment explains the strict boundaries surrounding sacred language. Certain formulations were preserved unchanged across centuries. Pronunciation mattered, sequence mattered, even spacing mattered. Scribal traditions reflect this awareness. A single misplaced letter was treated as a serious error, not because of aesthetic concern, but because of perceived structural consequence. The tablets, remembered as bearing letters that penetrated stone, intensify this concern. A letter that exists independently of surface suggests a form of language not bound by material limitation. Such language would not merely describe law, it would embody it. Later, mystical speculation proposed that the tablets functioned as conduits rather than containers. The stone did not hold the words, it revealed them. The writing was not imposed upon matter, but emerged through it. This idea aligns with descriptions of the letters being readable from both sides, suspended rather than etched. Whether understood literally or symbolically, these descriptions reflect a consistent intuition. Divine language operates differently. It does not conform to human constraints. It precedes them. The tablets represent a moment when this other mode of communication briefly intersected with human perception. This intersection could not last. The narrative emphasizes that the people were not prepared. The golden calf episode is often interpreted as idolatry, but ancient commentators also understood it as linguistic failure. The people demanded a visible, controllable representation of the divine. They rejected mediated language in favor of tangible symbol. The breaking of the tablets thus becomes an act of containment. The language was too direct, too unfiltered. It required a level of coherence the community did not possess. The second tablets restore law, but not immediacy. Human agency re-enters the process. Moses carves. Humanity participates. This participation changes everything. Language becomes collaborative. Interpretation becomes necessary. Debate becomes inevitable. The loss of angelic immediacy creates space for tradition, scholarship, and disagreement. This is not presented as failure, but as adaptation. Angelic language recedes into the background, remembered but inaccessible. Its existence explains why language matters so deeply in religious life. Words are no longer tools of creation, but they retain echoes of that power. They must be handled carefully. Early Christian writers inherited this tension. They spoke of heavenly mysteries revealed through incarnation rather than inscription. The Word becomes flesh, not text. This shift does not diminish language. It reorients it. Divine communication becomes relational rather than structural. Yet, the memory of heavenly writing persists. References to books in heaven, names written above, and words sealed until appointed times appear throughout early Christian texts. The idea that ultimate meaning exists beyond human language remains intact. Archaeological discoveries support the persistence of this belief. Sacred inscriptions often preserve archaic forms long after they fall out of everyday use. This deliberate preservation suggests reverence for linguistic proximity to origin. The older the form, the closer it was believed to be to divine speech. The stone tablets stand at the beginning of this trajectory. They are remembered not as texts to be decoded, but as encounters to be revered. Their language is not analyzed for grammar. It is honored for origin. This distinction explains why no tradition claims to have reconstructed the angelic language. The loss is accepted. Attempts to recover it are viewed with suspicion. What was given once is not meant to be reclaimed. The tablets thus teach a paradox. Language can convey divine will, but it cannot contain it. Words can guide, but they cannot replace alignment. Angelic language remains beyond reach, not because it was hidden, but because humanity learned the cost of holding it. What remains is a legacy of restraint. Language becomes sacred not through power, but through limitation. The silence surrounding angelic speech is not ignorance. It is remembrance shaped by humility. As centuries passed, reflection on the stone tablets shifted from origin to consequence. Ancient interpreters began asking not only why such a language existed, but what its withdrawal meant for humanity. The silence surrounding angelic speech became as meaningful as the speech itself. Absence, in this case, was interpreted as instruction. In many Jewish traditions, angels are described as beings of order rather than emotion. They do not repent, debate, or hesitate. Their obedience is immediate because their will is undivided. Human language, by contrast, reflects inner conflict. Words are shaped by fear, desire, memory, and doubt. This internal complexity makes human speech rich, but also unstable. The angelic language associated with the tablets therefore represented an impossible standard. It required unity of intention that humans could not sustain. The laws could be followed, debated, and taught, but the mode of speech that delivered them belonged to a realm without internal fracture. To retain that language would require humanity to exist without contradiction. This insight reframes the loss of angelic language not as punishment, but as protection. Ancient commentators increasingly suggested that the tablets were broken not because the people sinned alone, but because unmediated divine language could not coexist with human instability. The rupture preserved life by restoring distance. This idea finds resonance in priestly traditions. Sacred space was carefully regulated. Only certain individuals could enter certain areas, and only at specific times. The danger was not moral contamination alone, but existential exposure. Proximity to holiness without preparation was understood to be lethal. Language, like space, required boundaries. The idea that words could kill is not metaphorical in ancient thought. Blessings and curses were believed to have tangible effects. Improper speech could bring disaster upon individuals or communities. This belief explains the strict regulations surrounding vows, oaths, and sacred names. Speech was action. Angelic language, operating at the highest level of this hierarchy, would therefore be catastrophic if misused. Its withdrawal preserved a workable linguistic order for humanity. Words became instruments of teaching rather than forces of enactment. This transition reshaped religious practice. Emphasis shifted toward study, repetition, and communal interpretation. Meaning was no longer immediate. It unfolded through dialogue. The law remained divine, but understanding became human. This shift marked the birth of interpretive tradition as a central religious act. The role of angels adapted accordingly. They remained messengers, but their speech was increasingly portrayed as limited, task-specific, and temporary. They delivered information necessary for action, not comprehensive revelation. The fullness of divine speech was withheld. Early Christian texts echo this restraint. Angels announce events, warn of danger, or offer guidance, but they do not teach doctrine. Teaching becomes the role of inspired humans, mediated through narrative and relationship. Language is grounded in lived experience rather than cosmic command. This grounding reflects a broader shift in how truth is communicated. Rather than descending fully formed, meaning unfolds within history. It adapts to context. It requires interpretation. The loss of angelic immediacy creates space for moral responsibility. The stone tablets thus become a boundary marker. They represent the last moment when divine language intersected human history without mediation. Everything that follows operates within a different economy of meaning. Authority remains, but access is filtered. This filtering is evident in how sacred texts are treated. Copying becomes ritualized. Interpretation becomes communal. Disagreement becomes permissible, even necessary. Truth is no longer singularly voiced. It is sought collectively. Language, once feared for its power, becomes honored for its capacity to sustain community. Precision still matters, but flexibility is acknowledged. The sacred is no longer encountered through unfiltered speech, but through disciplined engagement. This evolution does not diminish the tablet's significance. On the contrary, it amplifies it. The memory of angelic language serves as a measure against which all human speech is judged. Words are no longer divine instruments, but they are never merely casual. The persistence of this memory explains why Claims of new divine languages were met with suspicion. Prophetic speech was tested. Revelations were weighed. Authority was no longer assumed by origin alone. It required consistency with what had already been given. In this way, the silence of angelic language becomes formative. It teaches restraint, humility, and caution. It reminds humanity that not all power is meant to be wielded, and not all knowledge is meant to be spoken. The stone tablets endure in tradition, not because they offer access to angelic speech, but because they mark its limit. They testify that divine communication once crossed into human history without filter, and that humanity was changed by the encounter. What followed was not abandonment, but adaptation. Language became a bridge rather than a force. Meaning replaced command. Interpretation replaced immediacy. The angelic language did not vanish, it retreated. Its presence is felt not in what is spoken, but in what remains unsaid. And in that silence, ancient communities learned how to listen. As reflection deepened, attention turned from angels themselves to the structure of the language attributed to them. Ancient thinkers began to suspect that angelic speech was not simply a different vocabulary, but a fundamentally different system of meaning. It did not rely on metaphor, persuasion, or narrative. It functioned through alignment, with order, precision, and sequence. Human language unfolds over time. A sentence begins, develops, and concludes. Meaning accumulates. Angelic language, by contrast, was imagined as simultaneous. Its meaning did not emerge through progression, but existed fully at once. This idea appears repeatedly in descriptions of heavenly knowledge as complete, sealed, or already known. Nothing is discovered. Everything is revealed. Such a system would explain why angelic speech is often described as overwhelming. Human cognition depends on sequence. To encounter meaning without sequence would feel destabilizing. The fear associated with angelic encounters in Scripture reflects not only awe, but cognitive overload. Humans are exposed to a form of meaning they cannot process gradually. The stone tablets, described as fully inscribed from the moment of their appearance, mirror this concept. They do not arrive word by word. They are presented as already complete. The people do not witness the act of writing. They encounter the result. The process is hidden. Only the outcome is given. This distinction matters. Human writing reveals its process. Errors can be traced. Intentions can be inferred. Divine writing, as described in the tablets, offers no such access. It resists reconstruction. It stands as a finished reality. Ancient linguistic philosophy supports this interpretation. Early thinkers understood that different forms of knowledge require different forms of expression. Practical instruction can be taught. Wisdom must be experienced. Divine order, if expressed at all, must be mediated. Angelic language, therefore, belongs to a category of meaning that exceeds instruction. The tablets translate that category into a survivable form. The law is intelligible, but its authority does not depend on explanation. The people are not invited to understand how the law came to be. They are invited to live in accordance with it. This dynamic reshaped how sacred texts were approached. Rather than seeking mastery over language, communities learned submission to it. Interpretation became an act of humility rather than control. The text was not conquered. It was entered. This posture contrasts sharply with magical traditions that sought to manipulate language for power. While such traditions existed, they were consistently marginal and controversial. The dominant religious response was restraint. Language was treated as a trust, not a tool. Angelic language thus became a negative reference point. It defined what humans were not permitted to do. Humans could speak to God, but not as angels speak. They could praise, petition, and question, but they could not command reality. The boundary is reinforced in narratives where humans attempt to bypass it. Such attempts are consistently portrayed as dangerous. Knowledge acquired without permission leads to chaos. Language spoken without alignment leads to judgment. These stories are not anti-knowledge, they are pro-order. The stone tablets function as a stabilizing memory within this framework. They remind humanity that divine order can be given but not seized. The law is received, not decoded. Its meaning unfolds through obedience rather than technique. This understanding shaped educational traditions. Study was valued, but mastery was never equated with authority. Even the most learned were bound by the same words as the unlearned. Language unified rather than stratified. The angelic language, by contrast, remained inaccessible precisely because it could not unify humanity. It required a coherence humans could not sustain collectively. Its return would not heal division. It would expose it. This insight explains why later traditions did not seek to restore angelic speech. The goal was not assent, but faithfulness. Divine communication was understood to adapt to human limitation rather than demand transcendence. The memory of angelic language thus served a stabilizing function. It set an upper boundary on religious ambition. It preserved humility in the face of mystery. It prevented language from becoming an instrument of domination. The tablets stand as the only exception, and even that exception is carefully circumscribed. They appear once, are broken once, and are never replicated in the same form. Their uniqueness is not accidental, it is instructive. By the time later communities reflected on these traditions, the question was no longer whether angelic language existed. It was whether humanity was ever meant to possess it. The prevailing answer was no. What humanity was meant to possess was guidance, memory, and responsibility. Language became the means by which these were sustained across generations. The loss of angelic immediacy made room for moral growth. The stone tablets thus mark the transition from revelation as event to revelation as inheritance. Divine speech enters history and then withdraws, leaving behind a structure within which humanity must live. Angelic language remains as a horizon, not a destination. It defines the limits of speech and the depth of meaning beyond those limits. And in recognizing those limits, ancient communities found not loss, but stability. By the late Second Temple period, reflection on divine language had reached a sober maturity. The question was no longer how to access angelic speech, but how to live faithfully without it. Scholars, scribes, and teachers increasingly treated the absence of unmediated divine language as a permanent condition rather than a temporary loss. This acceptance reshaped how revelation itself was understood. Heavenly speech in this framework belonged to a realm of perfection that history could not sustain. Human existence unfolded amid contingency, suffering, and moral choice. A language that enacted reality without ambiguity would leave no space for repentance, learning, or growth. Divine restraint, therefore, became an expression of mercy rather than distance. This perspective appears in texts that emphasize sealed knowledge. Certain truths are described as written in heaven but withheld on earth. Their concealment is not failure, but design. Humanity is entrusted with enough clarity to live responsibly, but not so much power that freedom is extinguished. Language follows the same logic. The stone tablets are remembered as a singular rupture in this order. They are not presented as a model to be repeated, but as a boundary that defines what cannot be sustained. Their destruction becomes part of their meaning. Revelation that exceeds human capacity must be withdrawn. This understanding shaped attitudes toward prophecy. Prophets did not claim to speak in angelic language. They spoke in human terms, shaped by culture, metaphor, and historical circumstance. Their authority rested not on linguistic purity, but on alignment with the divine will already given. Even visionary experiences were framed carefully. Visions revealed imagery rather than language. Symbols replaced speech. Interpretation became necessary. This shift protected the community from claims of absolute authority based on private revelation. Early Christian writers inherited this caution. They described heavenly realities using analogy and narrative, not technical language. When ineffable experiences were mentioned, they were often accompanied by explicit acknowledgement of linguistic failure. What was seen could not be spoken. Silence became testimony. This admission is crucial. It signals a mature recognition of language's limits. Rather than claiming access to angelic speech, authors confessed its impossibility. The divine was not diminished by this confession, it was honored. The stone tablets thus stand as an origin point for a theology of restraint. They demonstrate that revelation can be real, authoritative, and transformative without granting total access. Humanity is invited into covenant, not control. Archaeological evidence mirrors this shift. Later, sacred inscriptions prioritize clarity over mystery. Laws are explained. Instructions are detailed. The emphasis moves from awe to practice. This does not indicate secularization, but accommodation. Yet the memory of angelic language persists in subtle ways. The reverence for ancient forms, the preservation of archaic phrasing, and the belief that certain words carry deeper resonance all point to an enduring sense that language once stood closer to the divine source. Liturgical traditions preserve echoes of this belief. Prayer is often structured, repetitive, and precise. Rhythm and formulation matter, not because words compel God, but because they align the speaker with a remembered order. This alignment replaces access. Humans no longer speak as angels speak, but they orient themselves toward the same harmony. Language becomes a discipline rather than a force. The stone tablets in this light are less about lost knowledge and more about enduring responsibility. They establish a framework within which language must operate. Words are powerful, but not absolute. Meaning is real, but not exhaustive. The final generations of ancient interpreters understood this well. They did not lament the silence of angelic speech. They learned to listen within it. Interpretation, debate, and study became sacred acts precisely because they acknowledged limitation. In this way, the withdrawal of angelic language becomes the foundation of communal faith. No individual can claim final authority. Truth is pursued together across time through disciplined language. The tablets remain at the center of this pursuit. They remind humanity that divine speech once crossed into history without mediation, and that history could not contain it. What remains is not deficiency, but balance. Language continues to shape thought, behavior, and community. Its power is restrained, but not erased. The memory of angelic speech serves as a compass, pointing beyond what can be said toward what must be lived. Thus, the silence that followed the tablets is not emptiness. It is structure. It defines the space in which human words can matter without becoming destructive. In that space, meaning endures. As ancient tradition approached its later stages, reflection turned toward destiny rather than origin. If angelic language once existed and was withdrawn, what role did that memory play in humanity's future? The question was not speculative. It shaped expectations about judgment, restoration, and the ultimate resolution of history. Many ancient texts suggest that divine language was not erased, but reserved. Heavenly speech remained intact beyond the reach of time, preserved in realms untouched by decay. Human history unfolded beneath it, incomplete and provisional. This layered vision of reality allowed communities to endure ambiguity without surrendering hope. Apocalyptic literature expresses this vision with particular clarity. Hidden books, sealed words, and knowledge reserved for appointed times appear repeatedly. These images do not promise recovery through effort. They promise disclosure through timing. Angelic language, within this framework, is not something humanity will rediscover. It is something humanity will encounter when history itself is resolved. The distinction is crucial. Recovery implies mastery. Encounter implies surrender. Ancient interpreters consistently favored the latter. Divine speech would not return as a tool to be used, but as a reality to be faced. This expectation shaped attitudes toward the end of days. Judgment was not imagined as a debate or explanation. It was imagined as unveiling. Truth would no longer need interpretation because it would no longer be contested. Language would not persuade, it would disclose. Angels in these visions resume a central role. They do not argue cases or explain outcomes. They announce, separate, record, and execute. Their speech is minimal but decisive. The economy of angelic language returns precisely because human ambiguity has reached its conclusion. Within this eschatological horizon, the stone tablets acquire renewed significance. They are remembered as the first and only moment when unmediated divine language intersected human history. Their uniqueness foreshadows a future moment when mediation will no longer be necessary. Yet, this future is not depicted as a return to primordial conditions. It is portrayed as fulfillment rather than restoration. Humanity does not regain angelic language as a possession. It stands before it as a witness. The difference preserves human identity even at the end of history. This distinction reflects a consistent, ancient intuition. Angels and humans are not interchangeable. Their modes of existence, knowledge, and speech remain distinct even when aligned. Harmony does not require sameness. Early Christian writings articulate this carefully. Heavenly worship is described, but not replicated. Songs are heard, but not taught. Names are revealed, but not pronounced by humans. The boundary remains intact even as proximity increases. Language, once restrained for mercy, becomes restrained for clarity. At the end of history, ambiguity ends not because humans acquire angelic speech, but because truth no longer competes with falsehood. Words become unnecessary where reality is fully present. The stone tablets thus occupy both beginning and horizon. They mark the first rupture and anticipate the final unveiling. Their memory sustains patience. Humanity lives between what was once given and what will one day be revealed. This perspective transforms silence into expectation. The absence of angelic language is no longer loss alone. It is postponement. History unfolds within language suited to growth, repentance, and learning. Finality awaits a different register. Ancient communities found stability in this view. They did not seek to accelerate revelation. They guarded what was given and waited. Faithfulness replaced curiosity. Obedience replaced technique. The danger of premature access remained clear. Attempts to force revelation were seen as distortions of timing. True divine speech arrives when resistance is no longer possible and coercion is no longer needed. Thus, angelic language remains associated with certainty rather than instruction. It belongs to moments when meaning no longer unfolds but stands complete. History, by contrast, requires language that can bend without breaking. The tablets remind humanity that divine authority does not require constant speech. Silence can preserve freedom. Distance can protect growth. Language withheld can be as formative as language given. In this way, the memory of angelic language shapes not only belief, but patience. It teaches communities to live responsibly within incomplete understanding, trusting that clarity belongs to a time beyond effort. What was once engraved in stone remains engraved in expectation. The tablets do not whisper secrets. They stand, immovable, reminding humanity that some words are not lost, only reserved. As history progressed, the stone tablets, along with the concept of angelic language, took on new layers of meaning within both religious and philosophical discourse. The narrative of divine speech, once vivid and direct, became a distant memory, a symbol of what could never be fully grasped or replicated by human hands. The tablets were no longer objects to be found or decoded, but reminders of humanity's place within a larger cosmic order, one defined not by comprehension, but by humble obedience. The notion of angelic language, with its purity and power, gradually shifted from being an object of aspiration to a symbol of ultimate divine authority, an authority that humanity could never fully challenge or possess. By this point, it was understood that language, while essential to human experience, could not and should not contain the fullness of divine truth. Instead, humanity's responsibility lay in guarding the knowledge that had been entrusted to them, interpreting it faithfully without the illusion that they could control it. This perspective permeated later religious traditions, both in Jewish thought and early Christian doctrine. The unfolding of divine revelation was no longer viewed as a process of ascending to a higher language, but of learning to live within the confines of a language already given. The moment of the stone tablets, their appearance and their destruction, marked the beginning and the end of humanity's direct engagement with angelic speech. Everything that followed was an attempt to preserve the integrity of that moment while navigating the distance that came with it. The silence of angelic language, in this sense, became sacred. It was not an absence of meaning, but the presence of something too great to be fully understood or expressed. The space between divine speech and human language became a space of worship, reverence, and ultimately, transformation. The stone tablets were no longer the objective. They were the catalyst for a more profound understanding of divine order. Through the centuries, the idea that certain knowledge should remain sealed, withheld, or veiled took hold in both theological thought and mystical traditions. This mystery of divine language, its origin, its power, and its withdrawal, transformed into an enduring symbol of the relationship between humanity and the divine. The very silence surrounding the heavenly language became a form of teaching in itself, a lesson on the limits of human understanding and the necessity of patience and humility. And so, in the end, the legacy of the stone tablets is not one of a lost language that could be retrieved, but one of a profound revelation about the nature of divine communication. The language of angels, powerful and pure, serves as a reminder that language itself is not the final revelation, but a means by which humans might align themselves with divine will, live in accordance with that will, and await the moment when all will be revealed, not through speech, but in the fullness of truth. The tablets remain in this final reflection as a symbol of that moment when the divine reached into history with speech that transcended human limits, only to withdraw once humanity was not yet ready to bear it. They stand as a testament to a truth that cannot be fully contained, a language that cannot be fully spoken, and a message that continues to resonate through the ages, reminding us that some knowledge is too great to be spoken, and some truths too vast to be contained in any language. In this silence, humanity continues to seek, to learn, and to wait, not for a return of what was lost, but for the ultimate revelation which will come not through the words we speak, but through the reality that lies beyond them. And, in that final moment, the language of the angels will not need to be understood or translated. It will simply be known, and humanity will at last be fully aligned with that divine order they could only glimpse in the words etched upon stone so long ago.